Okay.
I'm going to remove the 4 screws holding the right side plate onto the fusion engine.
They only ship like a handful of solenoids at a
Removing the 832 button head screw at the front underneath the nozzle. And there's one more 440 Phillips head screw holding the solid side plate to the cylinder section. Removing that. And before you pull these apart, the solenoids are connected to the solid side plate, so flip it over, move your wire harness out of the way, and unplug your solenoids. Remove the bottom fitting, the input fitting, and you can slide the entire cylinder assembly off. To remove the solenoids, there are 2 832 by 1/2 inch long screws. Remove the rear one first because the front one is captured underneath these barb fittings, so if you start with the front one, it'll run out of a place to go unless the rear one's loosened first. So we're going to loosen the rear one and take it out completely. And then we loosen the front one, and it won't come out completely because it's trapped underneath the barbs, so you can't lose it. Pull the tube out of the way. When you're doing this, you also want to keep an eye out, do it on a clean surface so that you can see if any of the O-rings have dropped out of the way. There should be 2 in the manifold, and there's 2 more underneath the solenoids opposite that. So we now have access to both solenoids. Pulling them, simply pulling both out. When you do pull the solenoids out, they'll be marked. The poppet wire for the poppet solenoid is marked with a black mark. The nozzle solenoid has no mark. When they're installed back into the cylinder, the short line goes to the poppet assembly, the long line goes to the nozzle assembly. So you'll want to put your poppet solenoid back in line with the short line. So that's my black mark. The wires face back and to the top of the solenoid when you're putting it in the cylinder. And then the nozzle solenoid goes in right next to that, same orientation. Make sure both wires are out of the way when you push the manifold back down. You'll see that they're in the gap there rather than underneath the manifold. You can see also from the side, before tightening everything down, you'll see the shadow of the O-rings that they're still in place. You just want to double check that before you close everything up. When you do rewire it to the solid side plate, you have 2 ports here for the solenoids. The poppet solenoid goes in the lower port. The nozzle solenoid plugs into the upper port. So you're going to have the one with the black mark plugged into the lower port and the one with no mark plugged into the upper port. To put it back together, just reverse those steps. So you'll put the front screw tightened first this time, then the rear screw, and then you slide your cylinder assembly back onto the solid side plate, making sure to keep these wires out of the way of this area right here, otherwise they may get pinched.
Which area again?
This area right here in the solid side plate. Actually, I'll put the screws back in real quick and reassemble. So I'm tightening the front screw first, then the rear screw. Before I tighten it all the way, I'm double checking that the wires aren't pinched between the manifold and the cylinder. I can see light through there, so no, they're not. Tighten that down. Tighten the front one down. And then you have a wire track right here on the back side of the manifold. And you want to make sure that your wires are in that track when you install it onto the solid side plate. Otherwise, they'll get pinched between the solid side plate and the manifold. So I just push it into the track with my fingers and hold it there. It's actually easier to do this with the harness unplugged. Putting it back in the solid side plate, I'm just holding the wires with my fingers and just sliding it over. You may have to just slightly spin the front cylinder to get the fitting to line up. It's supposed to be slightly loose so you can remove it without tools and it's not overly tight. Now that I have it, I'm keeping pressure on the solid side plate between that and the manifold so that the wires can't pop up and into the gap there. Just slide it back, line up the hole, and you're going to want to apply blue Loctite to these screws so that they don't vibrate loose throughout use. For now, we're just doing this without as an example. Line up the hole, start the screw, tighten it, and then we're going to replace the 832 in the front. Same here, you want to put blue Loctite on this. We're just doing it without as an example. Back to the solenoid wires. We have the poppet solenoid with the black mark. I'm going to line that up with the plug and just push it down with the screwdriver blade, just very lightly. Same thing with the nozzle solenoid. And you'll notice that the nozzle solenoid is opposite the plug orientation of the poppet, so the plug is actually flipped upside down compared to the poppet. I'm just going to push that back in with the screwdriver, tuck those wires out of the way. And then reinstall the wire harness, just like this end was in. This plug only fits in one way. There's a notch index in it. Start it in the plug, just give it a little push with the screwdriver. To close it up, just replace the 440 screws on the outside, making sure that your wire harness isn't pinched in this area, and replace your input fitting.